My most dangerous discovery was not about mental illness. It was about people who see everything others miss and why this ability destroys them. In my clinical practice, I documented patients with what I call differentiated perception. Individuals who could read micro-expressions, sense hidden emotions, and perceive psychological patterns that escaped everyone else. They saw through social masks, detected lies instantly, and felt the unconscious tensions in every room. I called this discovery dangerous because these systemically ended up isolated, exhausted and unable to maintain normal relationships. Not because they were unstable, but because seeing everything came with a psychological cost no one understood. The case that revealed this discovery began with a patient I described in my private notes, a highly introverted, intuitive type who came in 1913 during my own psychological crisis following my break with Freud. This patient, representing what I would later categorize as the rarest personality type, possessed what I called undifferentiated intuitive perception. She could walk into any room and immediately sense the psychological atmosphere. Who was lying? Who was in emotional pain? Who harbored secret resentments? I wrote. The patient displays an extraordinary capacity for perceiving unconscious contents in others. But this faculty appears to cause her considerable distress rather than advantage. She couldn't engage in small talk because she saw through every social facade. She couldn't maintain friendships because people felt exposed and uncomfortable around her. She couldn't hold employment because her presence disrupted the collective unconscious agreements that keep groups functioning. I realized I wasn't treating pathology. I was observing what happens when the unconscious becomes too conscious. When perception becomes too differentiated for social survival. I documented her describing people with startling accuracy. She speaks of others as if she has access to their private thoughts and hidden motivations. When I verify her observations through careful questioning, they prove remarkably accurate. This wasn't psychosis or delusion. This was consciousness so advanced it had become socially dangerous. But I discovered something even more disturbing. Because this patient's extraordinary perception seemed impossible to explain, I began investigating what I would later term participation mystique. The psychological phenomenon where individuals with highly differentiated intuition become overwhelmed by unconscious contents from others. I wrote in my Red Book period notes. There are those among us whose psychic apparatus is so finely tuned that they absorb not merely conscious communications but the entire unconscious atmosphere of their environment. I identified something specific within my body's psychological typology. The introverted intuitive type, comprising a very small portion of the population, unconscious, feel deeply but perceive unconscious patterns with startling clarity. I observed that these individuals have what I call differentiated intuitive function. Their minds process not just obvious social cues, but unconscious emotional states, repressed content, and psychological patterns others cannot detect. They see the depression behind forced smiles. They sense the desperation beneath confident presentations. They feel the collective shadow that groups unconsciously agree to ignore. I wrote, the danger lies not in the perception itself but in the psychic isolation it creates. When one sees clearly what others cannot or will not see, one becomes a mirror that society cannot bear to look into. This creates what I call the problem of the superior function. When your greatest strength becomes your greatest burden, because it separates you from collective unconscious participation. But I discovered the real danger wasn't the perception itself. Because people with highly differentiated perception see others' unconscious contents clearly, they become targets for what I extensively documented as shadow projection, where people unconsciously attack them for reflecting what they refuse to acknowledge in themselves. I wrote, in Psychology of the Unconscious, nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent. But I discovered this principle extended to all relationships. When someone's shadow is reflected back through another person's clear perception, the unconscious mind has two choices: integrate the shadow or attack the mirror. I documented this pattern repeatedly in my clinical work. The person who sees clearly gets blamed for creating the problems they're merely observing. My patients with differentiated intuition experience this constantly. When they would gently suggest that someone seemed troubled, that person would explode at them for being negative or creating drama. When they'd expressed concern about obvious problems, they'd be accused of being judgmental or manufacturing issues where none existed. I realized this wasn't coincidence. It was psychological defense. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, I wrote, everything that irritates us about others can lead to understanding of ourselves. But for most people, it's easier to attack the person reflecting their shadow than to examine what's being reflected. This creates what I call the scapegoat phenomenon. Highly perceptive individuals often become the designated problem in every group they enter. not because they cause problems, but because they reveal problems that already exist in the collective unconscious. I observe the bearer of superior perception becomes the repository for all that the group cannot consciously acknowledge about itself. This pattern explains why these individuals don't just feel misunderstood, they feel systematically targeted by a force they can't rationally explain. But my most disturbing discovery was still to come, because I observed that overwhelming perception manifested differently in different individuals. I identified 4 distinct patterns within the introverted intuitive type, each representing a different way of processing unconscious contents from others. Type 1. The feeling intuitive. I documented patients who combined introverted intuition with differentiated feeling function. These individuals don't just see what's happening psychologically. They feel it in their own bodies. They absorb others' emotions so completely they often can't distinguish between their own feelings and those they've unconsciously absorbed. I wrote, the feeling intuitive lives in a state of perpetual emotional contagion, experiencing the unlived emotions of everyone in their environment. Type 2. The thinking intuitive. These individuals see psychological patterns and predict behavioral outcomes with startling accuracy. I observed they could forecast relationship failures, career disasters, and personal breakdowns months before they occurred, not through logical analysis, but through unconscious pattern recognition. I noted they possess an uncanny ability to perceive the logical conclusions of unconscious processes that others cannot yet see. Type 3. The sensation intuitive. I documented patients who could sense the physical manifestations of psychological states in others, detecting illness before symptoms appeared, sensing fatigue before it was acknowledged, or feeling the bodily tension that indicated emotional distress. I wrote, these individuals serve as early warning systems for psychological and physical disease in their environment. Type 4. The pure intuitive. The rarest type I encountered combined introverted intuition with what I called undifferentiated auxiliary function. They saw everything, but had difficulty organizing or expressing their perceptions coherently. I observed they live in a state of perpetual overwhelm, receiving vast amounts of unconscious information without adequate psychological structure to process it constructively. Understanding your specific pattern is crucial because each type requires different approaches to what I call the integration challenge. But first, you need to understand why I considered this discovery so dangerous. Because I observed the devastating effects of undifferentiated perception on my patients, I concluded that seeing everything without proper psychological integration posed genuine dangers to both individual and collective well-being. I identified 3 specific dangers that made this discovery so threatening. Danger 1. Collective unconscious disruption. I wrote, the individual who perceives too clearly threatens the collective agreements upon which social cohesion depends. When someone sees through the shared illusions that hold groups together, the unspoken agreements to ignore certain truths, they become a destabilizing force. I observe that organizations, families, and societies function partly through collective unconscious agreements about what will and won't be acknowledged. The highly perceptive individual inadvertently violates these agreements simply by existing authentically. Danger 2. Psychological isolation. I documented how differentiated perception creates what I called the problem of superior function. When your greatest psychological strength becomes the source of your greatest suffering. I wrote, the curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it. The individual becomes an island of awareness in an ocean of unconsciousness. This isolation isn't just social, it's existential. These individuals often report feeling living in a different reality from everyone around them. Danger 3. Identity dissolution. Most dangerously, I found that people who absorb unconscious contents from others often lose contact with their own authentic personality. They become so flooded with external psychological material that they can't distinguish between their own inner world and what they are absorbing from their environment. I called this participation mystique, a state where psychological boundaries dissolve and the individual becomes merged with collective unconscious contents. I wrote, the danger is not merely social exile, but psychological annihilation, the complete loss of individual identity in favor of collective possession. This is why I considered the integration of superior perception, not just therapeutically important, but psychologically urgent. Because unintegrated superior perception posed such dangers, I developed what I call the individuation process, a systematic approach to maintaining individual identity, while developing conscious relationship with unconscious contents. Phase 1, Recognition and Differentiation. I taught my highly perceptive patients to first recognize when they were absorbing psychological material that wasn't their own. I call this conscious discrimination, the ability to distinguish between authentic inner experience and unconsciously absorbed external content. I wrote the first task is to establish what belongs to you and what belongs to others. Without this discrimination there can be no individual development technique. I instructed patients to spend time in complete solitude daily, allowing absorbed material to settle so they could recognize their own authentic psychological voice. Phase 2. Shadow integration. I discovered that people who see other shadows clearly often do so because they haven't integrated their own. The more you deny your own capacity for deception, selfishness or cruelty, the more disturbed you'll be by seeing these qualities in others. I wrote, everything that irritates us about others can lead us standing of ourselves. But only if we have the courage to look inward, rather than remaining focused outward. Shadow integration means acknowledging that you contain every human quality you observe in others. This doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a complete person who can see clearly without judgment. Phase 3. Conscious participation. The final phase involves what I called conscious participation in the collective unconscious. The ability to engage with others' psychological contents without being overwhelmed or losing your individual identity. I wrote the individuated person can serve as a bridge between unconscious, helping to make the unconscious conscious in others, without sacrificing their own psychological integrity. This requires developing what I called psychological containers, the ability to hold others' unconscious contents temporarily while maintaining awareness that they are not your own. Because I understood that superior perception either destroys or transforms individuals, I studied historical figures to understand the difference between successful integration and psychological breakdown. The case of Nietzsche's an integrated perception. I was deeply influenced by Nietzsche's philosophy. But observe how to psychological collapse in memories, dreams, reflections. I wrote about Nietzsche's ability to see through social, religious and philosophical facades with devastating clarity. However, I noted that there never learned to integrate ease in his insights constructively instead of using his perception will service of healing. He wielded it as a weapon against society. I wrote, Nietzsche possessed extraordinary insight into human nature. But he remained identified with his superior function, rather than integrating into a balanced personality. I observed that nature's isolation and eventual breakdown represented what happens when superior perception remains unintegrated. The individual becomes consumed by what they see rather than transformed by it. The case of Meister Eckhart's successful integration. I extensively studied the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart, whom I considered an example of successfully integrated superior perception. Eckhart possessed what I called mystical intuition, the ability to perceive spiritual and psychological realities that others could not access. But unlike Nietzsche, Eckhart channeled his insights into compassionate service. I wrote, Eckhart transformed his superior perception into wisdom that could nourish others without overwhelming them. He saw clearly but spoke in ways that invited understanding rather than resistance. I noted that Eckhart's success came from what I called conscious humility. The recognition that superior perception is a gift to be shared wisely, not a weapon to be wielded. My own integration journey. Most significantly, I documented my own struggle with I called my confrontation with the unconscious from 1903 to 1919 recorded in the Red Book. I wrote, I was menaced by a psychosis, and was saved only by my ability to understand what was happening to me through my work with patients. My superior perception of unconscious contents, both my own and others, nearly destroyed me until I learned to integrate these experiences consciously. My breakthrough came when I realized that my overwhelming perceptions weren't pathological but evolutionary. They represented consciousness attempting to evolve beyond collective limitations. This realization transformed my approach to patients with similar gifts, because individuals with superior perception often face isolation. I emphasized the crucial importance of finding what I called the few who understand others, capable of engaging with differentiated consciousness without defensiveness. I wrote in the development of personality, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But this privilege cannot be realized in isolation. It requires witnessing by those capable of recognizing authenticity. I identified three essential types of relationships for the highly perceptive individual. Type 1, fellow individuated persons. I wrote the individuated recognizes another individuated person immediately. There is a quality of presence, an authenticity that cannot be fabricated. These connections often happen instantly and intensely. You recognize each other as members of what I call the conscious minority. These relationships are rare but essential for psychological survival. With fellow individuated persons, you can be completely authentic without fear of overwhelming or threatening them. Type 2, those engaged in individuation. I observed that people actively engaged in their own individuation process, therapy, inner work, spiritual practice can often handle superior perception without defensiveness. They may not possess it themselves, but they understand its value. I wrote, those who have begun to know themselves can bear to be known by others. Type 3 natural containers. I identified individuals who, while not possessing superior perception themselves, have what I called natural container function, the ability to hold psychological content without being overwhelmed by it. These might be mature individuals who have weathered significant life challenges. The recognition process I developed specific indicators for identifying safe relationships. They ask genuine questions about your observations rather than immediately defending against them. They can acknowledge their own contradictions and limitations without shame. They demonstrate what I called psychological mindedness, interest in inner reality. They maintain emotional stability when confronted with uncomfortable truth. They show genuine curiosity about consciousness and growth. Gradual revelation protocol. I taught a careful process for revealing perceptive abilities. 1. Begin with small, gentle observations. 2. Notice their response pattern to feedback. 3. Assess whether they become defensive or curious. 4. Gradually increase depth based on their demonstrated capacity. 5. Always frame insights as offerings rather than pronouncements. I emphasize the goal is not to find people who accept everything you see, but to find people who can engage with your perceptions as valuable contributions to understanding, rather than threats to their self-image. Because integrated superior perception serves both individual and collective development. I viewed successful individuation as essential not just for personal well-being but for the evolution of human consciousness itself. I wrote in The Undiscovered Self, the individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit, the one who brings about the change in society. I believe that individuals who successfully integrate superior perception become what I call culture carriers. People who help consciousness evolve. The 4 stages of transformation. Stage 1. Recognition without overwhelm. The first transformation occurs when you learn to acknowledge your perceptive abilities without being crushed by them. I called this conscious acceptance of the superior function. I wrote the beginning of wisdom is the recognition of what one actually is, not what one wishes to be or fears to be. Stage 2. Integration without isolation. The second stage involves learning to use your perception constructively while maintaining meaningful relationships. I called this social individuation, becoming authentically yourself while remaining connected to others. I observe the individuated person does not withdraw from the world but engages with it more consciously. Stage 3. Service without sacrifice. The third transformation happens when your perception becomes a gift you offer rather than a burden you carry. I called this conscious participation, using your abilities in service of others without depleting yourself. I wrote the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and then to offer that authentic self in service of the whole. Stage 4. Legacy without attachment. The final stage involves what I call transcendent function. Using your perception to contribute to collective consciousness, solution without attachment to whether others recognize or accept your contributions. I observe the individuated person works for the future, not for personal recognition in the present. The integration becomes cultural medicine. I believe that individuals who successfully integrate superior perception serve a vital evolutionary function. They see what collective consciousness is not yet ready to acknowledge, helping to prepare humanity for necessary developmental steps. I wrote, what is not brought to consciousness comes to us as fate. Highly perceptive individuals who learn integration help make unconscious contents conscious before they manifest destructively in collective behavior. But I warned about specific pitfalls that can derail this transformation. Because the path of integrating superior perception contains specific dangers, I documented the most common ways individuals derail their own transformation process. Pitfall 1. The inflation trap. I wrote extensively about psychological inflation, when individuals become identified with their superior function rather than integrating it consciously. In 2 essays on analytical psychology, I warned the danger is that the ego identifies with the archetype, leading to an inflation that cuts the individual off from human relationships. Highly perceptive individuals often fall into what I called the prophet complex, believing they must save everyone from unconsciousness. This leads to preaching judgment and eventual isolation. I observe the moment one believes oneself to be the bearer of absolute truth, one has fallen into the trap of unconscious possession by the very forces one seeks to understand. Pitfall 2. The withdrawal justification. I documented cases where individuals used their superior perception to justify complete withdrawal from society. They convinced themselves that others were too unconscious to be worth engaging, which I recognized as spiritual superiority masquerading as wisdom. I wrote, true individuation requires engagement with the unconscious world, not escape from it. The hermit who withdraws from life has not transcended it, but has been defeated by it. Pitfall 3. The helper's hay. I observed that some highly perceptive individuals become addicted to being needed. They define themselves entirely through their ability to see, and help others, losing contact with their own inner development. I warned, when perception becomes identity, the person disappears behind the function. This is not individuation but its opposite, the sacrifice of personality to role. Pitfall 4: the overwhelm return. Even successfully integrated individuals to regress during periods of stress, trauma or major life transitions. They stop maintaining their psychological boundaries and become flooded with others' unconscious contents. Again, I emphasized integration is not a permanent achievement but a dynamic process requiring constant conscious attention. The integration maintenance. I developed ongoing practices for maintaining healthy integration. Regular solitude for distinguishing your own psychological contents from absorbed material. Conscious choice about when and with whom to engage perceptive abilities. Ongoing shadow work to prevent projection of your own unconscious contents. Connection with others capable of providing reality checking and support. Creative expression as an outlet for overwhelming perceptual input. I wrote, the integrated person does not achieve perfection, but learns to dance consciously with their own psychological complexity. Because I understood superior perception within the context of collective psychological development, I viewed highly perceptive individuals as serving an essential evolutionary function for human consciousness. In the undiscovered self, I wrote, the individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit, the one who brings about the change in society. I believe that people with superior perception serve as what I called consciousness pioneers. Individuals whose psychological development precedes collective readiness. The historical pattern I observed that throughout history, individuals with superior perception often appeared before collective consciousness was ready to integrate their insights. They served as advanced scouts for psychological territories that humanity would eventually need to explore. I wrote, what appears in the individual first as psychological insight later manifests in the collective as cultural transformation. The individual serves as a laboratory for consciousness experiments that will eventually benefit the whole. The sensitive individual feels the collective problems first and most intensely. Their personal symptoms often reflect what the entire culture needs to address. The service without martyrdom. My crucial insight was that superior perception serves evolution best when it's integrated consciously rather than suffered unconsciously. The goal isn't to be a martyr to consciousness, but to be a bridge between what is and what's becoming. I wrote, the individuated person serves the collective not by sacrificing their individuality, but by developing it so completely that it becomes a gift to the whole. The ultimate integration. At the highest level of development, I observed individuals with superior perception hold their abilities lightly, seeing clearly without attachment to others, accepting what they see, perceiving deeply without compulsion to fix everything they observe. I called this the transcendent function. The ability to serve consciousness evolution naturally without forcing or preaching, simply by embodying more conscious ways of being. Remember my patient from 1913, the introverted during my own psychological crisis. After 3 years of working with my individuation process, her life transformed completely. She learned to distinguish between her own psychological contents and what she absorbed from others. She found work as a counselor where her differentiated perception helped troubled individuals. She built relationships with people who valued her insights rather than fearing them. Most importantly, she stopped experiencing her superior perception as a curse and began understanding it as what I called a gift requiring conscious development. I wrote about her transformation. The patient learned not to see less, but to see more wisely, not to perceive less deeply, but to engage more consciously with what she perceived. Her gift remained intact, but her relationship to it became integrated rather overwhelming. This represents my most dangerous discovery. That some individuals are born with consciousness that exceeds collective readiness. And this advanced perception will either destroy them through isolation, and overwhelm, or transform them into exactly what humanity needs for its psychological evolution. Your superior perception isn't a malfunction in your psychological makeup. It's an advanced feature of consciousness development. You are not broken because you see everything others miss. You're psychologically ahead of your time. The question isn't whether you should suppress your perception to fit in with collective unconsciousness. The question is whether you'll develop the individuation skills necessary to integrate your perception consciously. My individuation method offers a path from dangerous isolation to conscious service. From overwhelming perception to integrated wisdom. From psychological curse to evolutionary contribution. You were born to see everything, not to suffer in silence, but to serve. Consciousness evolution. The world needs your insights, but it needs them delivered with the integration, wisdom and strategic awareness that transform dangerous perception into cultural medicine. Your gift is not your burden. Your unconscious relationship to your gift is your burden. Learn to integrate it consciously, and you become exactly what I believe highly perceptive individuals were meant to be. Consciousness pioneers preparing humanity for psychological development that is inevitable but not yet obvious. My most dangerous discovery wasn't that some people see everything. It's that most people who see everything never learn to use what they see wisely. The danger isn't in the perception itself but in failing to develop conscious relationship with extraordinary abilities. You are not too much for this world. You are exactly what consciousness evolution requires. Once you learn to wield your perception as consciously as I learned to wield mine. The danger of seeing everything isn't that you see too much. It's that you might never learn to see with the integration and wisdom your gifts demand.